So art is a big part of your life. I'm wondering, like, during these adolescent years, is that when you started to discover art? Like, because you were probably introverted a little bit, isolated, and was that like an escape for you at an early age?
Absolutely. Yeah. For me, art was the only place that I could work through the pain of the bullying that I was going through. Because my situation, I think, is like a lot of trans kids of color across the US, which is that if you speak about the fact that you're being bullied, then you'll get bullied more because it outs you or somehow confirms that you are the thing that your bullies are saying that you are. And so I didn't really have any space to figure out who I was in my own terms before people started to tell me who I was through slurs. So slurs were the first words that I had to describe what I was, which isn't really kind because then what you are is only known as something that's bad or wrong. And so I was trying to, on the one hand, maintain the good graces of my peers while also questioning my own identity and also having to experience like really spectacular scenes of humiliation. And so the only place that I could go was not my parents, not a counselor at school, but was my art practice. So I started to do graphic design. I started to like make collages and mixed media images. I started to write poetry. At the time, I didn't understand it as poetry. I was just writing my feelings.
Sure.
And I would publish these things under pseudonyms. And I developed a sort of network of support of other queer kids from across the world. And they were saying, like, I feel the exact same way. And that is miraculous to me now when I look back. I'm like, how did I have the awareness as like a precocious early teen to be like, I can't do this alone. Like I need to reach out. There's a way in which pain is always looking for a witness. And so much of what's wrong with our culture today is that people are traumatized, but then we don't have the actual witnessing practice to move through the trauma. So people have to hold the trauma inside of them. But what art first was for me was a mechanism to actually alchemize the pain that I was going through into something outside of my body so that it could be witnessed by someone else. And that method, I think, is so intrinsic to all the art that I still make today, which is art is not just a professional trajectory. It's a healing ritual that actually allows me to take so much of the vitriol that I'm experiencing and do something with it that's meaningful.
Do you remember like your first piece of art, like in like the emotion that you were feeling in that piece of artwork? I'm curious, like that story. And then I'll lead into like your last piece of art. Like, is the evolution visible through your artwork? I guess is what I'm trying to get at.
I don't know if I remember the very first, but one that's coming to mind is like, I think I was in 6th grade where we had like a poetry unit and we had to write like, there's different kinds of poems, like form poem, soliloquy, like sonnet, whatever. And I took it way too seriously. And I like spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours working on these things. And I was writing these very deep poems about suffering, grief, family, trauma. And my teacher was like, this is incredible. You should submit this to like youth literary journals. And so I did, and I would get rejections because people only expect youth literary poetry to be about like flowers and happy things. And I was coming in like this dark, tortured poet. Like I was the original
A real
tortured
artist.
poet. Yes. Taylor Swift and I were both tortured poets growing up in the South in our own ways. And so I remember feeling this profound sense of relief. And also it was this kind of very stark juxtaposition where on the one hand, I was this incredibly academically astute, a successful person, but writing these very dark, tragic, sad, depressing poems. And in so many ways, I also wonder, like, why did no one in my school ask me, are you okay?
Right.
Like, no one was like, hey, can we get a little curious about why you keep on writing about like storms coming in and like decimating the lawn? Or like, I think I had a poem about like a pelican outside my window, like knocking on the window, trying to help me escape. Like just really deep metaphors.
That's definitely a sign, right?
Yeah, I've always wanted to do like an open mic where poets bring their like angsty teenage poetry and try to interpret it publicly, because I think I was really engaging with some complex themes, but it was before I knew so much. But that's why I always say poetry is actually our first language, and then it gets disciplined into speech. It's the most honest expression. You start grabbing for images, metaphors, things that you notice, and those feel more real to explain than a word like sad. It's devastating that we have so few words for an experience like sadness. But what's beautiful then is that we have to rely on things like colors or images or animals or motifs or metaphors to communicate the extent of it. And that's so much of what I was doing before I had any language around mental health. Then in terms of like if there's been a continuity in practice, I mean, yes, I still have to listen to the same like 10 angsty white bands that I grew up loving and worshiping in order to access that primordial sadness, in order to write. Even if I'm making something fun or happy, like a comedy show, I still have to get sad and in my feels in order to access that. That's me coming out as like a water sign and a deep Cancer, that like my first portal to every feeling is sadness.
Or most comics, right?
Right.
So tell me, so I'm getting a taste of your adolescence and filtering to your teenage years. Stanford, eventually. So you evolved and you worked hard and persevered through all this shit going on around you. What led you to Stanford, and what was it like there? Was that experience like ultimately like this freeing thing for you? Because Stanford's Stanford. It's still like made up of a lot of, people with certain agendas and certain belief systems.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering like if it was as freeing as maybe you thought it would be, or more so.
I was naive and I thought that all of California was like the Castro. I thought all of California was this like liberal oasis where queer people could roam free. So that was what motivated my desire to go to California, is this kind of like juvenile sense of like, this is going to be the opposite of Texas. And in some ways it really was. I mean, it was incredible that my first week in college, I was able to be out as can be, and I was able to be an activist for LGBTQ issues, and to start organizing around my community, something that I never could have done growing up in Texas. But I think what I experienced for the first time at Stanford, which I didn't experience was in Texas, was neoliberalism. What I mean by that is it was a lot of people who had rainbow flags on their doors, but were still homophobic and transphobic. A lot of people who believed in, quote, multiculturalism, but were still racist. And so what was confusing is that in Texas, you could know who the racists were because they were obvious about it. Whereas in California, it was the same kind of racism, but it was more subtle. So that was very strange to navigate. It's this profound sense of like, on the one hand, being told that I'm included, having all of the rhetoric of inclusion, but that not actually landing in me in a real meaningful way. So there's a profound discrepancy between the ways in which the school and my peers were performing a kind of inclusion that wasn't actually manifest. But once again, like with Texas, I think, I graduated 11 years ago. I just had my 10-year reunion last year, and I was full of so much excitement and grace and inclusion. I'm not someone to hold on to bitterness or resentment. I think that isn't productive or conducive to anything for me. I actually am able to recognize that every place has limitations and every place has amazing opportunities. And I feel deeply grateful that Stanford, for the first time, made me take myself seriously as an artist. I was part of a spoken word poetry collective called the Spoken Word Collective. Mm-hmm. And it was a majority Black, Indigenous, and POC queer artist collective, where we had a practice where every Sunday we would eat brunch together and we would do a check-in about our feelings, and we would like process our trauma together, and then we'd write. This idea that the only way that we could make art was being honest about what we were actually going through emotionally. And then we'd workshop each other's pieces. We put on shows together. And some of those people are celebrated artists today in the world, and some of my peers still, who inspire me so much. So even within these kind of institutions, what I've noticed especially is that people of color find each other and build infrastructure, kind of alternative underground economies. And that's the part of Stanford that I love so much, is that I met people who really gave me permission, I think for the first time, to take my art seriously.
I love that. And again, it's you figuring out your surroundings and your environment and how to like kind of make it work for yourself. I think that, again, is a key lesson for everyone.